The day Ethan Cole stopped being a billionaire, the only person who came looking for him was a woman he had helped when she could barely afford to keep a food cart on the street. By 9:12 that morning, the steps outside the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago were crowded with reporters, cameras, and strangers shouting questions about the collapse of Cole Meridian Logistics. Ethan had built the company from 2 delivery trucks into a national food distribution network, but now his personal accounts were temporarily frozen. His voting shares were under court review, and every headline made him sound like the architect of his own ruin. He kept walking until Vanessa stepped in front of him. She wore a cream wool coat and dark glasses, looking polished enough for the cameras even though her hands were trembling. Without raising her voice, she handed him a sealed envelope. "My attorney filed the separation papers this morning," she said. Ethan stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. They had been married for 14 years. "Today," he asked. Vanessa glanced toward the reporters. "I can't go down with you." The sentence landed harder than every accusation shouted from the sidewalk. Before Ethan could answer, she turned, entered a waiting black SUV, and disappeared into traffic. By evening, the home they had shared on the North Shore no longer felt like a home. Art had been removed from the walls. Half the closets were empty, and a bank representative had left instructions for surrendering the property by the end of the week if the court did not intervene. Ethan stood in the silent kitchen with his phone face down beside him. He had 37 missed calls, but none were from people asking whether he was all right. Board members wanted statements. Attorneys wanted documents. Former friends wanted distance. At 8:46 p.m., headlights swept across the front windows. Ethan assumed it was another reporter until he saw an aging white food truck Maria, still kept for community events, pull into the circular drive. A woman climbed out carrying a dented metal cash box against her chest. Maria Alvarez looked older than the last time he had seen her, but he recognized the determined way she walked. 10 years earlier, she had sold tamales and coffee near Cole Meridian's first warehouse. He had not seen her since helping her move into a licensed commercial kitchen after a fire damaged her cart. Now she stood at the door of a mansion he no longer truly owned. "Maria," Ethan said, ashamed that she had found him like this. "How did you know?" "Because your company sent me something it should never have sent," she replied. She placed the metal box on the kitchen counter and opened it. Inside were invoices, shipping records, and a printed authorization bearing Ethan's electronic signature. Maria pointed to the date. "This payment was approved in your name 3 days after the board locked you out of the system." Ethan looked at the signature, then at her. Maria lowered her voice. "You didn't just lose your company, Ethan. Someone planned for you to take the blame." The collapse had looked sudden to the public, but Maria's invoices proved that someone had been preparing Ethan's downfall long before the first headline appeared. 6 weeks earlier, Cole Meridian Logistics had still been valued at nearly $4 billion, with contracts serving grocery chains, hospital systems, and regional food producers across the country. Ethan had believed the company was facing a difficult quarter, not an extinction event. Then one of Cole Meridian's largest clients abruptly canceled a national distribution agreement, citing repeated billing irregularities and unexplained routing fees. The lost contract triggered a covenant in the company's loan agreements, allowing lenders to demand additional collateral within 10 business days. Graham Pierce, Cole Meridian's chief financial officer, assured Ethan that the company had enough liquidity to satisfy the requirement. 3 days later, the numbers changed. Internal reports suddenly showed tens of millions of dollars in losses that had never appeared in previous forecasts. Suppliers began asking for payment in advance. 2 banks reduced Cole Meridian's credit lines. News outlets received anonymous documents claiming Ethan had hidden the company's financial condition from investors. Because Ethan had pledged part of his personal fortune and voting shares to support the company's expansion, the crisis spread directly into his private life. When Cole Meridian's stock fell, the value of his collateral collapsed with it. His accounts were frozen while lenders, regulators, and the board determined which assets could be claimed. "People think billionaires have billions sitting in a checking account," Ethan told Maria as they stood in the empty kitchen. "Most of what I had was tied to the company. When the shares fell and the loans were called, Everything fell together. Maria listened without pity, then arranged her invoices across the counter in date order. Her food business had grown from one cart into a network of shared kitchens and mobile vendors that used Cole Meridian for refrigerated deliveries. For 8 months, she had received legitimate transportation invoices followed by separate charges labeled as emergency capacity fees. The second payments were directed to a company called North Lake Supply Services, which did not appear anywhere in her original contract. "I question them every month," Maria said. "Your billing department told me the fees had been approved by executive management." Ethan examined the account numbers. "I've never heard of North Lake." "Neither had I." Maria opened another folder containing emails and payment confirmations from vendors across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. Several small businesses had received identical instructions. Each transfer was modest enough to avoid immediate attention, but together they represented millions of dollars. Ethan called Evelyn Brooks, an attorney specializing in financial investigations and commercial litigation, who had represented him during Cole Meridian's early expansion. Evelyn arrived shortly before midnight, still wearing the black suit she had worn to court that day. She studied the records without promising anything. "Invoices can be fabricated," she said. "Bank transfers, registration records, and access logs are harder to explain away." Using public corporate filings, she traced North Lake Supply Services to Graham Pierce's younger brother. The company's mailing address was tied to the same Lake Geneva property where Graham had hosted executive retreats for years. Evelyn turned the screen toward Ethan. "Your chief financial officer's name is not on the registration," she said, "but his brother's is." Ethan stared at the filing while the final pieces of his trust began to fracture. Then Maria placed one more invoice on the counter. Unlike the others, it had never been paid. Across the bottom was a handwritten instruction from Graham's office: destroy all previous copies before processing the replacement. 10 years before Maria arrived at Ethan's empty mansion with proof of betrayal, she had stood in the rain watching the only business she owned disappear beneath smoke and fire department foam. At the time, Maria Alvarez was 29, recently widowed, and raising her 8-year-old son, Mateo, from a one-bedroom apartment on Chicago's southwest side. Her food cart was not glamorous, but it paid the rent. Every weekday, she parked near Cole Meridian's first warehouse and sold tamales, breakfast burritos, and hot coffee to truck drivers beginning their routes before sunrise. Ethan was not yet famous then. Cole Meridian consisted of 2 delivery trucks, a rented warehouse, and a small office where he worked 12-hour days trying to convince grocery stores that his company could deliver on time. He bought coffee from Maria most mornings, learned Mateo's name, and always paid the full price even when she tried to give him extra food. Then, on a cold October evening, a faulty electrical connection sparked inside the cart after Maria had closed for the day. No one was hurt, but the damage destroyed her warming equipment, ruined most of her supplies, and left the cart unable to pass inspection. Without a licensed kitchen or working equipment, the city suspended her permit. Maria had less than $400 in savings and a landlord already asking when the rent would be paid. She returned to the damaged cart the next morning because she did not know where else to go. Rain ran through her hair as she stood beside the blackened serving window, trying to decide whether to sell her wedding ring. Ethan found her there before dawn. He did not offer a speech, take a photograph, or promise to solve her life. He simply asked what she needed to reopen legally. Maria told him the truth: replacement equipment, inspection fees, access to a commercial kitchen, and enough time to rebuild her customer base. Ethan called a restaurant owner who rented and used kitchen space overnight, then purchased every package of food Maria could still safely prepare there and served it to his warehouse staff. The order gave her enough immediate cash to cover part of the rent. For the remaining expenses, he offered a small personal loan with no interest and wrote the agreement by hand on a sheet of yellow legal paper. Maria hesitated before signing. "What happens if I can't pay you back?" she asked. Ethan looked at the damaged cart and then at the unopened warehouse behind him. "Then you tell me before you disappear," he said. Businesses survive bad months when people are honest early enough. He never told reporters, never used her story in an advertisement, and refused when a marketing employee suggested featuring Maria in a campaign about local entrepreneurs. Within 14 months, Maria repaid every dollar. She kept the handwritten agreement because it reminded her that Ethan had treated her like a business owner when everyone else saw a desperate widow. Standing in his empty kitchen a decade later, Maria removed that same folded yellow page from metal box. Beneath it were the original North Lake invoices Graham's office had ordered her to destroy. "You trusted me when I had nothing but a damaged card," she told Ethan. "I kept these because I knew honest records matter when powerful people want them gone." Then she revealed why Graham had become desperate. 2 days earlier, someone from his office had offered Maria $50,000 to surrender every original copy. Maria's offer was not to save Ethan Cole. It was to make him prove he was still worth trusting. The morning after she revealed the $50,000 bribe, Ethan sat across from her in the back of Alvarez Community Kitchens, a converted brick warehouse on Chicago's southwest side that now supported 12 food trucks and 3 small catering companies. The space smelled of roasted peppers, coffee, and fresh bread. Employees moved between stainless steel prep tables while delivery drivers checked routes on tablets near the loading dock. 10 years earlier, Maria had owned one damaged cart. Now she managed a business with 32 employees and contracts serving schools, offices, and neighborhood clinics. Ethan had expected her to offer him money, a temporary room, or another gesture of gratitude he would be too ashamed to accept. Instead, she placed a 20-page operations proposal in front of him. "I want to hire you for 6 weeks," she said. "Our delivery costs are up 18%. 2 kitchens are duplicating routes, and we're losing refrigerated capacity every Friday afternoon." Ethan stared at the proposal. "Maria, my name is on every business channel in the country. Customers could leave because I walked into this building. Then give them a reason not to. You are risking everything you built." "No," she replied. "I reviewed the route model you created for Cole Meridian before the company became national. I compared it with our current system. If your plan works, we save more than $200,000 a year." She leaned forward. "I am not paying you because you helped me. I am paying you because you know how to fix this." The distinction struck deeper than sympathy ever could. Ethan had spent 6 weeks hearing that he was reckless, dishonest, and finished. Maria was the first person to place a real problem in front of him and expect a real answer. Still, he hesitated. His accounts were frozen. His attorneys had warned him not to make public business moves without review, and every decision now seemed capable of hurting someone else. "Let Evelyn review the contract," he said. "If she finds any risk to you, I'll walk away." Maria nodded. "Fair." Evelyn Brooks arrived that afternoon, carrying copies of the North Lake invoices and a list of records she intended to seek through formal legal requests. She approved a limited consulting agreement that kept Ethan away from Maria's financial accounts and required every recommendation to be documented. Over the next 2 days, Ethan mapped delivery windows, driver hours, refrigeration limits, and customer locations across a 50-mile service area. The work was humbling. He used a borrowed laptop at a folding table beside the loading dock. But for the first time since losing Cole Meridian, his mind was focused on something other than his own collapse. Meanwhile, Evelyn collected transfer confirmations from more than 40 small food businesses. The records matched Maria's invoices closely enough to establish a pattern. Evelyn still needed bank records to prove where the money ended up, but North Lake was no longer an isolated billing error. Late that evening, Evelyn called Ethan and Maria into the office. "I recovered part of an email chain from the initial court order production in the asset freeze case," she said. The original warning had been written by Nora Bennett, a compliance analyst Ethan did not remember meeting, and sent 3 months before Cole Meridian's collapse to Graham and 2 board members. It stated that irregular vendor codes and unexplained payment diversions could trigger the company's loan covenants and force an emergency asset sale. Minutes later, Graham had forwarded the message from his private account to Vanessa with a short note about protecting her position if Ethan was removed. Ethan read the forwarded copy twice. Graham had known. 2 board members had known. And Vanessa had been warned before the collapse began. Vanessa had known Ethan was being pushed out 3 months before his empire collapsed, and she had chosen silence because Graham promised the fall would never reach her. Ethan met her the next afternoon in a private conference room at Evelyn Brooks's office, where the windows overlooked a gray stretch of the Chicago River. Vanessa arrived in a camel-colored coat, carrying herself with the same controlled elegance she had shown outside the courthouse. But the confidence disappeared when Evelyn placed the recovered email on the table. Ethan did not raise his voice. "Graham forwarded this to you." Vanessa looked at the message, then at him. "He told me it was a contingency plan, a plan to remove me from my own company. He said the board was worried about your borrowing and the expansion." Her hands tightened around her purse. "He said they might ask you to step aside temporarily, restructure the debt, and bring you back once the pressure passed." Ethan stared at the woman he had trusted for 14 years. "And you never told me." Vanessa's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "Graham said if I interfered, the lenders could come after everything in both our names. He offered to place the house and part of the investment portfolio beyond the company's reach." The truth hurt because it was not dramatic. Vanessa had not helped steal the money. She had simply accepted protection for herself while Ethan walked into a trap. "Did you sign anything?" Evelyn asked. Vanessa shook her head. "No, but I agreed not to contact Ethan's attorneys or the independent board members." Ethan leaned back slowly. "You let me believe we were facing the crisis together." "I was afraid," Vanessa whispered. "So was I," he said. "The difference is I did not know you had already chosen which one of us would be saved." Vanessa left without asking him to forgive her. Less than an hour later, Maria called from Alvarez Community Kitchens. Her largest hospital food contract had been placed under an emergency vendor integrity review after anonymous allegations linked her company to Ethan's investigation. The hospital would allow the already scheduled delivery to proceed, but failure to complete it could turn the provisional suspension into a permanent cancellation. 2 smaller customers had also delayed future orders, and a refrigerated truck company suddenly demanded payment in advance. Ethan reached the warehouse before sunset and found Maria standing over a scheduling board while employees waited for direction. The timing pointed toward Graham, though Ethan and Maria had no evidence yet that could prove he was behind the pressure. Whether Graham had ordered every move or merely encouraged the rumors, the message was unmistakable. Helping Ethan was becoming expensive. "We can survive losing the office accounts," Maria said, keeping her voice steady. "But the hospital contract covers almost half our weekly revenue." The order involved prepared meals and specialty food deliveries to 3 medical centers across the city. If Alvarez Community Kitchens failed to complete the next shipment, the review could end the relationship entirely. Ethan studied the routes, available trucks, and inventory. 1 refrigerated vehicle was in the repair shop. Another carrier had canceled. A winter storm was forecast to reach Chicago the following afternoon. "How long before the kitchens have to shut down?" he asked. Maria looked toward the 32 employees watching from the production floor. 48 hours. Then her phone rang again. The hospital had moved the delivery deadline forward because of the approaching storm. They no longer had 48 hours. They had until 6 o'clock the next evening. By 8 that morning, Ethan Cole had less than 10 hours to save Maria's company, and the only fleet he could rely on belonged to people who no longer worked for him. Snow had already begun sweeping across Chicago when Ethan spread route maps over a stainless steel prep table at Alvarez Community Kitchens. 3 hospitals needed more than 4,000 prepared meals and specialty food packages before 6 o'clock that evening. 1 refrigerated truck was still in the repair shop. The replacement carrier had canceled, and road conditions were expected to worsen by the hour. Maria stood beside him with a list of available vehicles, trying to hide the fear that 32 employees might lose their jobs if the delivery failed. Ethan divided the order into temperature zones, reassigned smaller vans to nearby medical centers, and planned staggered loading times so food would spend as little time as possible outside refrigeration. The plan was possible on paper, but they were still short 2 experienced drivers. At 8:17 a.m., a red pickup pulled into the loading lot. Behind it came an older delivery van and a refrigerated box truck with Cole Meridian's faded logo still visible beneath white paint. 3 former drivers stepped out wearing winter coats and work boots. The first was Raymond Ellis, who had driven Ethan's original route nearly 20 years earlier and now operated a refrigerated box truck he had recently acquired from Cole Meridian's fleet lessor after the company suspended operations. "We heard what happened," Raymond said. Ethan looked at the truck. "You don't work for me anymore." "No," Raymond replied. "But you stood by us when fuel prices nearly shut the company down. We can stand by you for one day." More former employees arrived over the next hour. Not because Ethan had called them, but because word had spread that he was working without pay to protect Maria's hospital contract. By noon, every available vehicle was loaded. Ethan rode with Raymond through streets already covered by several inches of snow, using a borrowed radio to redirect drivers around stalled traffic and closed ramps. When one van lost heat near Cicero Avenue, Maria arranged for a nearby kitchen partner to hold the food temporarily, while Ethan transferred the most temperature-sensitive packages into Raymond's truck. No one performed a miracle. They solved one problem at a time, checked every temperature seal, and documented every delay. At 5:42 p.m., the final truck reached the 3rd hospital's loading dock. The receiving supervisor signed the delivery record with 18 minutes remaining. Maria stood in the snow outside the warehouse when Ethan returned, her face exhausted and wet from melting flakes. "The hospital lifted the immediate suspension," she said. "They're keeping the contract active while they complete the review." Inside, employees applauded, but Ethan raised one hand. "You saved your own company," he told them. "I only helped organize what was already here." That evening, a local reporter filmed the Alvarez staff unloading empty containers and interviewed several drivers who described why they had returned. For the first time since Cole Meridian collapsed, Ethan's name appeared in the news beside words other than fraud and failure. The victory was small, but it reminded him that leadership could survive after money, title, and reputation disappeared. As the warehouse quieted, Raymond approached carrying a dusty black device wrapped in an old shipping manifest. While inspecting the truck after acquiring it, he had discovered an onboard backup routing unit hidden behind the maintenance panel, equipment the fleet lessor had never removed. This mirrored dispatch updates whenever the truck returned to the main network, Raymond said. Ethan turned the device over in his hands. A label on the back showed it had last synchronized 6 hours before Graham ordered the central archive erased. The device Raymond found did not merely preserve missing data. It led Ethan back to the name he had seen in the recovered warning. Evelyn Brooks delivered the routing unit to a certified digital forensics lab before sunrise, preserving every access record so Graham's attorneys could not later claim the evidence had been altered. By noon, technicians recovered a partial archive from the night millions of dollars vanished. The unit had preserved dispatch assignments, vendor code changes, and billing references that could be matched against Cole Meridian's accounting records. The data showed refrigerated shipments being reassigned through temporary North Lake vendor codes that did not correspond to real trucks, drivers, or warehouses. More disturbing was the login history Evelyn obtained through the investigation. Ethan's electronic credentials had approved several transfers, while building security records placed him at a charity dinner nearly 20 miles away. Someone had copied his digital certificate and used it after his access should have been restricted. Yet Evelyn warned that suspicious records alone would not be enough. They needed someone who understood how the operational and financial systems had been connected. That person appeared the following morning at Alvarez Community Kitchens. Nora Bennett stood near the loading entrance in a dark winter coat, clutching a cardboard document box with both hands. Ethan recognized her name before he recognized her face. She had worked in Cole Meridian's compliance department until Graham fired her 4 months earlier for what he called unauthorized access to confidential financial data. Nora looked exhausted, as though she had spent weeks deciding whether speaking would destroy what remained of her career. "I saw the news about the hospital deliveries," she told Ethan. "When those drivers came back for you, I realized I might not be the only person who remembered who you were before this happened." Inside Maria's office, Nora examined the recovered files and confirmed that the routing unit had preserved an unedited copy of the company's vendor code and transaction assignment map. She explained that Graham had created temporary vendor codes, redirected customer payments, and then recorded the missing revenue as operating losses. When the losses triggered Cole Meridian's loan covenants, he pushed the board toward an emergency asset sale through firms connected to his family. Nora had discovered the pattern and reported it internally. Graham removed her access the same day and terminated her before she could contact independent directors. From the box, she produced printed emails, audit notes, and a copy of the report she had tried to submit. Together, the documents connected Graham to the false losses, the copied credentials, and the planned sale. For the first time, Ethan had evidence strong enough to challenge the story that had ruined him. That evening, a longtime intermediary close to Graham contacted Ethan privately with an off-the-record proposal. Graham and the directors aligned with him would support returning several disputed voting shares, withdraw key claims against Ethan, and stop opposing the release of part of his personal assets. His condition was simple. Ethan had to sign a statement claiming Maria fabricated the North Lake invoices after he hired her. If Ethan agreed before 9 the next morning, Graham promised he could have part of his old life back. If he refused, Graham would bury Maria's company in litigation and keep every employee tied up for years. An emergency hearing on the proposed asset sale had already been scheduled for 9 the next morning. Evelyn now had only hours to authenticate the new evidence and ask the court to admit it. Ethan stood alone in the warehouse after everyone left, staring at the handwritten loan agreement Maria had preserved for 10 years. By sunrise, he would either recover his fortune by betraying the woman who had trusted him or risk losing everything again to tell the truth. At the emergency hearing already scheduled for 9 that morning, Ethan Cole gave up his last chance to recover his fortune quietly and chose to expose the truth where Graham Pierce could no longer control it. Instead of signing the statement accusing Maria of fabricating evidence, Ethan entered the federal courtroom beside Maria Alvarez, Nora Bennett, and Evelyn Brooks. Reporters filled the hallway outside, but inside, the atmosphere was almost silent. Evelyn submitted the original North Lake invoices, the available bank transfer records, Nora's compliance reports, and the recovered routing archive from Cole Meridian's retired truck. Digital forensics specialists confirmed that Ethan's electronic certificate had been copied and used while security records placed him nearly 20 miles away. When the routing archive was matched with accounting records, it showed customer payments being redirected through temporary vendor codes and shell companies before the missing money was recorded as operating losses. Those false losses triggered Cole Meridian's loan covenants, weakened its stock, and allowed firms connected to Graham's family to prepare bids for valuable assets at deeply reduced prices. Graham's attorneys argued that the records had been misunderstood and that Ethan was using former employees to escape responsibility. Then Maria testified. She explained the unexplained fees, the order to destroy original invoices, and the $50,000 offer made in exchange for surrendering every copy. Nora followed, describing how Graham removed her access and fired her after she tried to alert independent directors. Ethan spoke last. He admitted that he had expanded too aggressively, trusted reports he should have questioned, and used too much of his personal wealth to guarantee company debt. "Those are my decisions," he said, "but I did not authorize these transfers, and I will not blame an innocent woman to recover what I lost." After a brief recess, the judge issued a temporary order halting the asset sale, preserving the disputed accounts, and prohibiting the destruction of any Cole Meridian records. It was not a declaration that Ethan had won, but for the first time, Graham could no longer control what disappeared next. Over the following days, Cole Meridian's independent directors removed Graham from all authority. Federal investigators opened a formal inquiry into fraud, misuse of digital credentials, and the shell company network. The court released part of Ethan's personal accounts after determining that the central fraud allegations against him were no longer supported by the available evidence. Creditors agreed to begin restructuring negotiations instead of forcing immediate liquidation. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had once shouted accusations now asked whether Ethan planned to reclaim his company. He gave them no answer. Vanessa found him later beside the Riverwalk. She said she had told investigators everything Graham promised her and offered to testify if needed. Then she asked whether there was any chance they could begin again. Ethan looked at the woman he had loved for 14 years and felt sadness instead of anger. When I had nothing left to offer, you protected the life you wanted instead of the person standing beside you, he said quietly. I hope you build something honest from here, but it will not be with me. Several days later, after the court halted the asset sale and creditors agreed to restructuring talks, Ethan received an offer from a private investment group prepared to finance his return to Cole Meridian. They would help him regain control, restore his title, and rebuild much of his fortune. There was only one condition. Maria could not hold any position in the new company. Ethan Cole was one signature away from reclaiming his empire, but the contract demanded that he erase the woman who had helped prove he was innocent. The investment group offered enough capital to restore his position at Cole Meridian, settle the remaining disputes, and rebuild much of the fortune he had lost. Their attorneys spoke carefully, calling Maria Alvarez a reputational complication whose connection to the investigation could frighten lenders and institutional clients. She could remain a supplier, they said, but she could never become an executive, shareholder, or public partner. Ethan looked through the conference room windows at the Chicago skyline he had once believed belonged to men like him. Then he closed the contract without signing it. You are offering me the same company with different names on the doors, he said. A company where loyalty is negotiable and inconvenient people are removed. He declined the deal and chose a smaller future he could respect. During Cole Meridian's court-supervised restructuring, Ethan sold the voting shares that had been released back to him. The proceeds allowed him to satisfy his personal guarantees, reach agreements with creditors, and preserve enough capital to begin again without pretending the collapse had never happened. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near a neighborhood park, bought a used SUV, and returned each morning to the folding table beside Maria's loading dock. Together, they created Common Table Logistics, a regional distribution company serving independent restaurants, food trucks, community kitchens, and family-owned producers that national carriers often ignored. Maria contributed her customer network and operating company. Ethan invested his remaining capital and logistics experience. Their partnership agreement gave them equal ownership and required both signatures for every major financial decision. They published transparent rates, prohibited hidden vendor charges, created an independent compliance channel, and shared annual profits with employees when measurable goals were reached. Common Table's first rule was simple. Problems had to be reported early, before numbers could hide them, and before people felt they had to disappear. The first months were harder than either admitted. Banks hesitated to lend to Ethan, customers questioned whether his name would bring unwanted attention, and larger competitors expected the company to disappear before winter. But the hospital system Maria's team had fought to serve became their first major client. Former Cole Meridian drivers joined them, followed by small food producers who had lost money through North Lake's false fees. 1 year later, Common Table coordinated a network of 28 company-owned, leased, and contracted trucks across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. It was not a billion-dollar empire, but every number in its reports represented work honestly completed. Graham Pierce was later charged in connection with the fraudulent transfers and shell company network. Vanessa completed the separation without a public fight, and Ethan wished her well without confusing regret with repaired trust. On Common Table's first anniversary, Maria asked Ethan to meet her at the corner where her original food cart had once stood. Mateo, now 19 and studying supply chain management, helped coordinate the anniversary event beside the same woman whose food cart had once kept a roof over his head. A new cart was parked there now, operated by a young single mother participating in Maria's small business program. Maria handed Ethan the yellow loan agreement he had written 10 years earlier. Across the bottom, she had stamped the words "paid in full." Ethan smiled. "You repaid this years ago." "Not the part that mattered," Maria said. She reminded him that after her cart burned, He had looked beyond the damage and treated her like someone capable of rebuilding. When the world later saw only a disgraced billionaire, she had tried to return the same faith. Ethan watched common table trucks moving through the morning traffic and finally understood that his greatest investment had never been a company. It had been one quiet act of kindness given without witnesses or expectations. Then the debt was settled the night you came to that empty house, he said. You were the only person who showed up without asking what I still owned. Maria placed the agreement back in his hand. Around them, Chicago moved into another working day, unaware that something more valuable than a fortune had been restored on that street corner. Proof that loyalty, honesty, and kindness were forms of wealth no bankruptcy could ever take away.